Dr. Blackwell, are you pretty good to go?
Yeah.
Okay, if you want to go ahead, you can share your screen and I'll kind of do a quick introduction.
Great.
Great. So everybody, welcome back. Wanted, thank you for coming back and joining us for this second and final invited speaker presentation. And we are really so lucky and grateful to have Dr. Maylei Blackwell with us. Dr. Blackwell is the author of the landmark Chicana Power, Contested Histories of Feminism in the Chicano Movement, as well as a co-editor of Chicana Movidas, New Narratives of Activism and Feminism in the Movement Era. Her forthcoming book, Scales of Resistance, Indigenous Women's Transborder Organizing, draws on 20 years of research accompanying Indigenous women's organizing in Mexico and its diaspora. Her research on social movements in the US and Latin America, transborder activism, and Indigenous politics and migration have appeared in the US, Mexico, and Brazil in journals such as Latino Studies, Meridians, Signs, Atslin, Journal of Latin American Studies, Desacatos, and Revista Estudos Feministas. She is a professor and vice chair of Chicana and Chicano and Central American Studies and Gender Studies, and is affiliated faculty in American Indian Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. And she is, of course, the co-creator and co-director of the digital story platform Mapping Indigenous Los Angeles, which is what we've asked her in part to speak to us today about. And again, I would like to say, as someone from LA, this particular project has been incredibly vital and relevant for teaching and advocacy, especially in the context of maps, data, and digital scholarship. And I'm really personally excited to hear Dr. Blackwell's presentation here on the development of this project and just sharing more about it. So please join me in giving a very warm virtual welcome to Dr. Blackwell. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm calling and joining you from Tovongnar, from the unceded Tongva territory. And I live in Long Beach, California, where I'm calling from. So I'm honoring the ancestors and caretakers of this land, who I honor for their historic role, their current, and their emerging role as we continue in the future. So grateful for everyone inviting me to speak a little bit and share on the Mapping Indigenous LA project and kind of new works I've been up to. I was just realizing that, because of the COVID, because of pandemic, I hadn't been so in touch with this project because I launched another project. So, coming back to this one and touching the unfinished work, this is giving me a great reminder. So I want to share something with you today called Mapping Indigenous LA, Stories of Place, Responsibility, and Relation Making. And I'll just share mostly from my experience. I came to the project because I received, I was honored as an alumni at Cal State Long Beach, and we call it Cal State Pavogna. Because it's the campus, and this has been a historic struggle, encompasses one of the Tongva sacred sites, Pavogna, which they just run an important ruling. But as I was accepting that honor, I was honored with Georgiana Sanchez, a Chumash elder, and who was also a professor of mine back in the day when I was in college there. And some Luiseño elders. The award was named after Sofia Robles, a Luiseño elder. So I was talking about what it's like for an American Indian person to be working with migrant Indigenous folks, and then the California Native folks were there too. So we had multiple Indigenous LAs in the room, and just thinking so much about how to translate our stories to each other and see each other. So I'm showing you a map. Of course, in LA, everyone orients the map towards the freeways. But what we don't know is that the freeways and the rivers and a lot of historical markers are actually based on Tongva places. And this is a map that this amazing center did on just the original villages. And so much Tongva mapping has happened since we began our project. And I think I applied and I wrote the first grant for us in 2011, 12, if I'm not mistaken. And it was a seed grant internal to UCLA. and it was on like mega diversity, right? And I wrote it about, well, the diversity hidden within these diversities within the category Latino or Latinx is all these indigenous groups who are migrating within Asian American Pacific Islander. Of course, that category hides over the amazing Pacific Islander community, the American Indian community that, came to Hollywood. It came in relocation days in the 1950s and termination policies that kind of were part of the government's ongoing, settler policies of eradication. And that often our communities are recognized as the American Indian communities and not the Native California folks, right, whose land we're on, because many of them are not federally recognized. So I wrote up the grant inviting my colleague Mashana Goman and Wendy Teeter, and we originally had Keith Camacho as well, who stayed on with us for the first round, and then we seated Wendy and Mashana and I. So this is, if you want to kind of click on and follow, and I'll share some of the work that I've done, and there's so much amazing wealth of projects in this one project. So it's a hub of story maps. We initially spent like basically a year communicating and working with Tongva elders, and specifically at the Curravangna Springs, which is right by the UCLA campus, and that is encompassed by the university high school. And so we met with high school students, and we worked with the Springs Library there, and tried to help with their digitization. So we kind of worked with the community for a long time about what a mapping project might include. And then from there, we spent a year, kind of quarter by quarter, we went into development. We met with our digital humanities people at UCLA. We decided to go with the ArcGIS as our main story mapping platform. And spring quarter, Mashana took over and helped build out the basic platform, the kind of hub that holds all our maps together. And so we went kind of phase by phase, building things out. But we just basically were holding the idea that there's a sedimented layer of indigenous communities in Los Angeles that, people in the popular imagination of LA and Hollywood don't take the time to do this work. And it was just the beginning project to make the communities and their stories, their sense of place, visible to each other. Since then, my colleague Mashana Goman was appointed as like the special commissioner of UCLA, trying to facilitate tribal relationships. And she's done this amazing work doing the land acknowledgement. And her and Wendy Teeter, after this project, was launched, and also they went on to do honoring our ancestors. Merkutu-based project that really did some amazing work with the way that the campus itself, and under Wendy Teeter's leadership and with the Tongva community, have been really in the leadership of the NAGPRA and the returning the bones of the ancestors to the communities that they belong to. So this is kind of a starting place, and many of the PIs went on to do other things. I'm just marking that. The first map that I got to do was the Latin American Indigenous Diaspora map, and I convened, I think it was between 8 and 10 community researchers. So some of the maps, of course, include multiple communities within them. Los Angeles is home to 250,000 Zapotecs and over 60,000 Maya, who began to migrate, of course, because of the U.S. intervention in Central America and Guatemala, and the Dirty War that was basically a genocidal war against indigenous communities. So many Maya began to migrate, settled into the kind of Pico Union district. Pico Union is also home to a large Salvadoran community. Oaxacans came in the 80s and 90s. So this map was really beautiful, telling the story of how a Oaxacan kind of civil society and Mayan organizations made community. I love this picture. I always include this. This is from one of the collaborators, Lourdes Alberto, who's from a community called Yalalag in the highlands of Oaxaca. And how the basketball team, so Oaxacans tend to play basketball rather than soccer because of the hilly nature of their home terrain. And so those basketball leagues ended up being the ways in which people organized their hometown associations, but also the civic, kind of the civil society of this Indigenous diaspora. So this map tells the story of different Maya organizations, different community groups, the Galaguetza, that became such a large event. It moved from, the LA Forum to this huge park, Lincoln Park in LA, and it became the Oaxacan Heritage Month. And it has, a proclamation from the mayor. These are some of the main collaborators I've worked with over 15, 20 years, Odelia Romero and her daughter, Janet Martinez. This is Isaiah Pasos, who at the time was heading up Oro, one of the organizations founded out of that Normandy Park. So we region, and he's it's called the Oaxacan Regional Organization would be in English. And this is Dr. Gaspar Rivera Salgado, a Mixtec scholar who's at the UCLA Labor Center and a major scholar of Indigenous migration. So we worked with the communities to create the map. And of course the map, like there's all these things to keep updating. I was just looking at this, it made me sad. This interview with Policarpo Chao, a leader of Maya Vision, he passed during COVID because of COVID. So we lost a lot of Indigenous leaders, including a Tongva elder, Julia Bogany, and many others. So COVID, as many people know, was particularly devastating for many communities of color, and especially for Indigenous communities. So yeah, I hadn't really presented since that. So from that map, my collaborators in the Zapotec community, we're so excited. They want to do a band map. There's from the different hometown associations, there's like 26 different Philharmonic bands in LA. So that it's like a musical landscape, and they wanted to do a culinary map, and they were just so excited to go. They wanted to do a linguistic map. But of course we were still trying to, work on, our team, worked on an educational map. Mashana, under her leadership, worked with Luiseño and Gabrieleño, the Tongva and the Tataviam folks to do their own maps. So they have their own story maps. And some of the long-term maps that have been, for me, most challenging are the ones that cross communities. So those other amazing maps are now up, and we had a Tongva educational summit where we developed with Tongva educators a training for elementary school teachers, because there's this notorious 4th grade assignment where kids are asked to make missions, out of sugar cubes or those sticks from the paletas from the I don't know what they're, popsicles, I guess, in English. And so the Tongva elders and educators really helped to create some important curriculum. So a long-term map that I've been directing, and we haven't finished, but it has so many parts, is a cross currents and crossroads map, right? So the idea that LA is not just the land, but the water. So there's canoeing cultures from Pacific Island, Tongan and Tongva canoeing cultures to talk about. And so these are some of the sites we've been working on that, in fact, there were 2 important American Indian leaders in the Chicano movement that worked for La Raza magazine. There was an amazing native garden that was here. Red Circle Project Powwow is a powwow that's educational for TwoSpirit and allied communities about HIV/AIDS, the Spirit Run, Indigenous Peoples Day, LA. I had the chance to go and share this project with the LA City Council Commission as they were trying to figure out if they were going to change Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day, and many of our collaborators were also in this conversation. So some of my students began working on parts of this map, trying to edit the video and the stories. In 2017, we made a walking tour for downtown. Initially, we were all like, we're going to do artificial intelligence, we're going to do like AI, we're going to do geo-reference tours where, like Waze, when the stories will pop up as you cross the sites and you could hear the stories. I mean, we were so ambitious. And so some of this has come to fruition and some of this is just kind of finished work with students that's, to sit back and come back to, but we were able to complete this interview with Gloria Arianes, also someone who was an important figure in the Chicano movement. She was part of the Brown Berets. She left the Brown Berets and formed a women's Brown Beret contingent, Las Adelitas, and then came back to her Tongva roots and is now a Tongva elder and educator. Another map that's close to my heart and I've been working on for a long time is the TwoSpirit Map. So just the LGBT queer Indigenous community of LA, including Tongva artists, the Red Circle project I mentioned, the founder, Elsa Natswood. These are some of the interviews I've finished and their collaboration. The City of Angel Two-Spirit Society Cats, which I'm a founding member of. And then Miss Trans World, some of the Native trans activists really shook up that world by competing Miss California, Miss so-and-so states, but Navajo Nation, Miss Apache, White Earth, etc. I'll show you that picture. So, documenting their stories of LA also. So we're kind of not just doing tribal histories, but communities within communities. So they started Indigenous Pride to go along with Indigenous Peoples Day. And then the Vela Mouche, right, which is the Oaxacan Indigenous tradition. I invited students to help me edit these, but this is Maritza Sanchez, some of these stories. So that was the current queen of the Vela Mouche, and this is Maritza. This is the calenda that happens before the Galaguetza, the procession that happens. You can tell they're walking down. I believe this is Olympic. And the Mouche is a third gender category that's, part of the Zapotec cultural roots. As we know, colonization, as Deborah Miranda has said, wasn't just a genocide, but a gendercide. So many Indigenous peoples had multiple genders. I think Dene, in the Dene languages, there's 35 different gender identifications. The Zapotec Mouche category, which has survived in diaspora. So just giving life to some of these histories and stories has been really important to me. So Maritza told the story about how she first came out as transgender and then kind of re-indigenized and brought her Indigenous identity and her transgender identity by embracing the Mouche category. So there's really great footage of the Vela Mouche. One of the maps, I worked about 18 months with EPIC, Pacific Islander map, empowering Pacific Islander communities. And some of my students, the ones with the little stars, as part of their honors project, worked on, we were super ambitious in our grant writing and we were making up story pods and etc. And then, we got some of these projects done with the little asterisks. So the Office of Samoan Affairs and kind of the South Bay part of Los Angeles, the Hawaiian festivals got documented and interviews got done, and the Tongan churches, a map of the Tongan churches. But our advisor, Julianne Anesti, started to take over this project too, and this is continuing on. Another mapping project we did was in collaboration with the Tlaculu Locos. This was a mural. This is the mural. So in downtown Central Library, this is kind of one of those pastoral scenes that was done. And, of course, it shows like Indigenous people in subservient positions. And so these panels of the mural were done by Oaxacan muralists, right, who have a diaspora between the Valles Centrales, the Central Valleys, and LA. I write about this in an article I published in Latino Studies, but basically how the regions of Oaxaca are getting mapped onto neighborhoods of LA, where the Valles Centrales are being, the Central Valleys and the Highland communities are mapped onto the West Side communities of Los Angeles and the Pico Union district. So you can kind of see the LA references here, the West Coast gang sign, but the LA street, South LA kind of topography on this young man's body. So the mapping part that we did for this project was a language map. We did language surveying. which we learned that we did it at the Calendas, right? And at the community. So everybody was densely hanging out in their hometown community. So we realized we densely got some other communities and not, like maybe the widest spread. So we learned a lot, but I did this in collaboration with Gaspar Rivera Salgado and a young Zapotec scholar from USC, Michelle Vasquez Ruiz. And I'm looking for the map of that Cielo did on the languages after, more recently, they just got it done. And I'm not finding the actual map, but this is their website. So I'll go back and look. So along comes COVID and, lots of the projects kind of come to a halt because how do we get out in the community and interview? Other projects, are just moving more slowly. We did make some progress on, editing videos, etc. But as was announced, Andy announced, I'm finishing this book that has a collaboration with the Coordinadora Nacional de Mujeres Indígenas, the CONAMI, which is the National Coordinator of Indigenous Women. I've been working with them since almost their founding. They were founded in 97. I started working with them in 99. And with the FIAB, which is a migrant indigenous or binational organization of Oaxacans. And so realizing that I had some of the founding documents and a lot of like second and third generation activists don't even have access to those documents, and how because one's a national network and one is a binational organization, there's no central place to archive. So I began the Mobile Indigenous Community Archives. It's as an Indigenous memory project. So some of the projects, this is a continental gathering of Indigenous women called ECMIA, the Enlace Continental de Mujeres Indígenas. These are FIAB meetings here. So over this, oops, I'm going backwards somehow. Over the whole last academic year, then last fall, I spent a lot of time just doing the kind of digital landscape, the archival landscape of UCLA and the communities and where they wanted to be. And then I taught a class on Indigenous community archives, and we got to access the digital materials. We did kind of 3 small projects for each of the 2 organizations. And there's several other community collaborators, Maya groups. There's this amazing home video collection of Zapotecs, right? Because they came in the 80s, so they have a VHS collection. So we consulted the organization, the members who helped to gather the digital material. So this is how we could work through COVID. We created viewing circles where the community helped to do the digital or the metadata development by remembering who's in this picture, etc. We worked with this amazing labor photographer, David Bacon, and his collection about the FIAB. And then the students helped to populate the metadata spreadsheets, those infamous spreadsheets. And then we were kind of pirating Mukutu as a highlight part of our study. So they're not open to the public yet, but we're developing a Mika hub, and we have the 2 community groups in there. And we're trying to figure out what we're going to continue to do with that. It's pretty complicated to use. It's not super easy. And we did want members to be able to upload. And so we're working on that to kind of figure out, but it's fully bilingual. It's the idea of the Indigenous Memory Project of different Indigenous movements and movements in the Latin American Indigenous diaspora. So digitizing documents, videos, photos, ephemera, and thinking about how the migrant generation passes on their papers, videos, VHS tapes, etc. And then how, because, we're talking about, so I mentioned LA has 250,000 Zapotecs, but the Mixtec community and Triqui community in California is really large, and that's part of the FIAB experience. So the FIAB, for example, organizes in the farm worker community. 30% of all farm workers in California are Oaxacan Indigenous community members. So our viewing circles were basically with farm worker folks. And so just thinking about how they asked us to help develop popular ed materials popular education materials for their history. They wanted to feature more women, how women were in the founding. So, 2 student teams worked on those. We also had a timeline we developed both for the Konami and the FIAB. The Konami team in Mexico, the Mexico team developed huge, sets of bios for the different activist leaders. So it's been really amazing. Something actually we would have never been able to do in a live classroom. Well, maybe, but like having that technology and the thinking about like connecting with people from Fresno and the farm worker communities to Mexico and Southern Mexico, like I don't think we would have done that before. So, the pandemic, the Zoomlandia gave us a different kind of set. I'm just showing you the metadata, which is always exciting. At least I can nerd out with folks who probably do think this is exciting. So I'll stop there and just, like us on Facebook, check out the other projects that have kind of come through this. Yeah, let's see, let me check this out. And yeah, and knowing we couldn't even keep up with all our community collaborators, and some of them, the 2 women that I mentioned, Odilia and Romer and Janet, yeah, this is the project, began to try to map the language participants, and they did this during COVID too, out of their the Undocu Indigenous funds. So this mother-daughter duo raised, I don't know what the final number, but like $1.4 million to help undocumented Indigenous communities in LA County with basic direct aid and food support. And by using kind of their intake data from these grants, they did this, let's see, they did this amazing map that helped them figure out the where people are living and the languages they spoke. So this was similar to what we were doing in data but we were going to community events. So yeah, it's a different data visualization. And they did this in collaboration with Shannon Speed and with one of the legal centers at UCLA too. So there's a continuing collaboration, but it's really beautiful. And we were balancing multiple communities. Like, can we do a 3rd Zapotec map when the Pacific Islander folks don't have their map yet, and the Tatavia map wasn't finished? And so you can kind of see like the different kinds of things we were juggling. So I'll end there so we can have some discussion. Thank you all.
Thank you. That was wonderful. I think kind of like yesterday, maybe we might take a minute or so, kind of think about some questions. Want to remind everybody about just sort of, being thoughtful and coming up with questions. Take your time, ask yourself if we need to ask it, and let's take a minute to kind of think about it. And again, feel free to drop in the questions into the chat, and we can, Angela, Justin, and I can kind of pick things out from the chat. Or feel free to right now just raise your virtual hand and we can kind of set up a queue. We have until about 12:45 for this conversation. So let's take a minute and start formulating some questions. And thank you, Dr. Blackwell. That was really wonderful. I actually, a colleague of mine from UCLA shared the CELO map just the other day, just really randomly, and it's a wonderful story map.
Yeah, I'm so happy they got to do it and they found other collaborators, and yeah, it's an amazing map. And also not worrying, like, is this data set perfect for visual, like, no, it was actually collected in a pandemic, and that was a really organic way to do it. And we did code our language map, so at some point our data from the language map we maybe can give it to CLO or see what they want to do with that.
Mm-hmm. I think as we kind of wait, if it's okay with everybody, I would like to ask one question, because I'm just, in hearing you talk about all of this work, um, it's amazing that you've been able to sort of work and partner and just collaborate with so many different people. It's kind of staggering, really, over the years of how connected I think this is. And I think something that really got me at the beginning of your talk was sort of how initially you sort of had this, layer of Indigenous people in LA and making them visible to one another. And I was kind of wondering, like just throughout the work, how have you sort of been looking at your audience? That's something that we've talked a lot about, is sort of like our audiences. Who has the audience changed for you, or how have you thought about audience in this work?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for that question, Mandy. We were honestly doing it for ourselves. I mean, that was my motivation, to help each other see each other, right? And because it's painful to be erased, certainly for folks who are not federally recognized, that they're often, dismissed, and, relying on federal government and a colonial legacy, process. So of course we were committed to featuring the Tongva and several Tongva maps, and first and foremost. And you mentioned the wealth of the connections, and I think that's just based on, like, we had to have several PIs. So a lot of the Tongva maps, of course, were based on Wendy Teeter's long-term collaboration and trust. Um, and Mashana did a lot of, outreach to tribal leaders in the various tribal community leaders. And she helped guide students who would take on projects to do single maps. And then the kind of bigger collaborative community maps, I sometimes led teams, and then sometimes I've been plotting through them slowly and having students work with me. So I think it's having a diversity of Pacific, like the Pacific Islander piece, because we lost our first collaborator, like that took us the longest to make, because we didn't have that organic connection. So we slowly, brought in Juliana and Nessie and started working with Epic. But, at the time they were really organizing around the census. And so we wanted to do story pods for them at the events they were already organizing for gatherings for the census, so that they could be counted. So it's also, it's timing, it's partnering in a way that doesn't disrupt their flow and their work that they're doing, and supports them. But like some, we couldn't keep up with them, like these amazing talented women of CLO, we couldn't keep producing map after map, because we were juggling being accountable to other communities. And so sometimes it's just support, they took this. There's another map too that Gaspar did. I'll figure out at some point. I have to put these all together. He just did with students, and visualizing just the stories of Indigenous migration in LA with other Oaxacans. So it's just that I think introducing the set of tools, and then not being super, like using it as a set of building knowledge sharing, but wealth within the, oh, that's my timer to myself to stop presenting. That it's a kind of knowledge sharing, skill sharing exercise, but keeping it in the community is, things go slow. There's sometimes conflict, conflict between groups or within groups, or, so it's a slow process. Yeah, but also just knowing that it can grow and grow. It grows outside of our project. It grows alongside of it. Many of the people who were in that first Latin American Indigenous diaspora map have gone on to do their own maps too. So
There's a follow-up kind of question from Tess that I think kind of you can build on, is, having worked with multiple groups on the mapping project, do you have recommendations for how you work with such a large team? So sort of specific kind of ideas for working with a lot of people on these projects.
yeah, it's kind of like a pie, maybe. Like each point person is like a point to a whole slice of pie. first have a good party, like invite like the convivencia in Spanish, but the conviviality, I guess it would be in English, which is not such a used word, but like creating kind of a space of sharing, of, you know, thinking together, of sharing food. And we did that for some of the community meetings between communities too. And yeah, just knowing that they'll move maybe at uneven speeds. Initially, like that first map, and it could be so much bigger. So also knowing like to keep the parameters somewhat narrow, because that I think that's the problem with the other maps that and because they're across communities, so it's such different histories, and the temporality of different community orgs is different. Whereas all in the Latin American, and we're only basically talking about Zapotec, Mixtec, and Maya. So that was a little, and they're organized together anyway. So that was a little easier to hold. But yeah, we just made a Google Doc, and we checked in with I checked in with each team, and, you know, set up a timeline, and had a, you know, research assistant that would meet with folks. So we were really the portal to bringing in the materials. People had never really organized around the west side, around St. Anne's Church, for example. Oaxacans, there's so many Oaxacans that their saints migrated with them. So we did a part of the map is the migration of saints to St. Anne's Church, and the processions that happen around the church, you know, in this more affluent west side neighborhood. So, you know, I targeted like, let's tell the story of this because we haven't seen that. So my research at the time was Dr. Brenda Nicolas, who's now a professor at Loyola Marymount. So we did a lot of that work just as our, you know, kind of professor, research assistant, but then a lot of the other parts of the map just organically came from Comunidad Ishim, who was led by Floridama Bosch Lopez, who's also now a professor. So some folks were like grad students within the community. She's also a Maya professor at UCLA in my department. Some were, you know, community organizations who were doing their own kind of projects, and they fed into the map. So it's just, I don't know, sometimes I think it's a little bit of a miracle that that one got done, because it was such a big collaboration. But I think having a pretty fixed timeline, at least saying, you know, we were trying to do it over a summer, and I think it took us probably till December to really get it done. But there's so much, we could open that up and update it, and we probably should. But yeah, having parameters, I guess, like any project, like this is when it ends, this is what it includes. And then having meetings where you check back in, or everyone brings what they have and they show it to each other. A kind of community accountability, I think, and then a final product screening and adjustments. I think those are important steps along the way.
Cool. Matt has a question. Matt Sisk, one of our fellows, and this is actually, I think, one thing that I think a lot of us are probably really interested in and kind of grapple with.
To ask it in person, or
should
I just read it?
Matt, do you want to kind of bring it up, or should we just read it?
Sure, I'm happy to.
Great.
Yeah, I think I'm technically able to do that. Yeah, so I think sometimes, as Andy was starting to say, a lot of us struggle with the fact that the technology that we use for visualization or for telling data-driven stories constrains the output in some ways, particularly when you're talking about mapping, where it's always going to be fixed in this very like downward-looking, you know, lens of sort of the way that we view space from far above. Are there any cases in this sort of indigenous mapping projects where you see or you feel that that constraint is affecting sort of the final visualization product?
Yeah, we kind of hit against this so much, and in some ways you just have to like let it go, you know. And just keep working with it. So first is the actual georeferencing. Like we didn't want, in the Tongva case, we didn't want people like cruising by their sacred sites where things weren't open. So we had to like make the georeference larger. Or like we were gonna have a Maya sacred site where it was Maya daykeepers gather. And it's just in an alley in Highland Park. And the community is getting gentrified there too. So just like their ability to do ceremony was kind of hitting against like more middle class people who were like, what's that fire doing in our alley? You know, like a pretty big fire too. So, and then of course in the communities I work with, there's undocumented people. So like the visualization or referencing of people and places isn't always safe. And then finally, there's just cosmologically, like it's not two-dimensional the way Indigenous cosmologies. I mean, there's more understanding now about pluriversal understandings instead of the universal understanding. But just like when I started thinking about, could we have a canoes map, a water, I was like, oh my gosh, because it's all star-based. And could we like look up and see the stars? And, you know, like I started kind of going all crazy with what could this all be? And the star map, could it go with a canoe map? And, you know, so I think the story part of ArcGIS helps because then we see different ways that the community does understand itself. And we work that in, like some of the first maps are quite narrative, like it has probably too much text. That's also, you know, I'm working with all kinds of different people, you know, literary scholars and archaeologists, and, you know, we had a pretty diverse team. And then if you look at the landing page, we also included like Tongva visualizations of their own maps. So yeah, let's see if I can show you. Oops. Wait, I might be taking us somewhere else. Yeah, this map. This is a map, right? This is at Pavone. This is a map. So like also creating, Mashana did this. She created a lot of space to, you know, put art and different kinds of visual representation. So we try to embed within the technology the idea that there's different cartographic knowledge that's not based in the Western Occidental, you know, mode of mapping. But, and then I think the story part that there's a lot of videos helps. But yeah, we ran into this all the time. And the short answer is yes. Yeah. So, and like, there's so much more that could have happened. We actually, it's like you do it because you don't know what you're getting into. And I think all of you probably know what you're getting into more than we did, because I basically am an oral historian and a community history person. And it's like, I didn't know like what I was really doing at the point that I was starting, not that I really know now, but like half the time I'm just bumbling through things. And like, maybe if we knew it all and knew all the limitations, we wouldn't have undertaken it. But yeah, so yeah.
And that's wonderful to hear. I think for a lot of us, I think it's a great, I don't know, it's really relatable, I think. And, you know, one part, we're pretty much coming up to time. So I don't know if anybody else kind of wants to jump in with questions. And I see some comments in the chat, but, you know, one thing that I just love hearing you talking about all these maps is just sort of how active the story maps are. So that they're not just sort of reflecting or even doing these oral histories, but there's the maps themselves are really creating conversation while you're doing them. And I think that that's one thing that, I mean, I could hear, you know, you talk about that probably for the rest of today, but was that like an intentional thing, or is that just something that you kind of see happening as you're doing this?
Oh, definitely. The idea, the whole idea of the platform was to create relationality and a sense of responsibility, because even folks who are relocated American Indian folks or part of a Indigenous diaspora from other parts, you know, Oceania, et cetera, like people really have to work to understand that we're also visitors on Tongva land. So creating a sense of responsibility to the Indigenous land we're on and the Indigenous people whose land we're on. But then also trying to break down the ways different communities are invisibilized in these categories, Asian Pacific Islander, which those things shouldn't really be together. It should be Pacific Islander, you know, or the way Hispanicization and the category Latino hides all these Indigenous communities within it. So yeah, I feel that people being able to talk to each other and see each other, and then the Two-Spirit communities that cross all of these different experiences and people meeting each other and knowing each other, or but there's still, I mean, there is conflict, like in the formal, there's, you know, some people have told me that in the formal, like Native American Commission, like the different community actors that have been nominated, that there's, you know, this kind of like, oh, aren't they just Mexicans? Like there's this dismissal, you know. And so we're trying to, you know, do a lot of education around that kind of anti-Mexican, anti-Latin American bias. You know, the just that the arrogance that, you know, federally recognized folks aren't the only people here. And in fact, this is not whose land we're on. So just there's a lot of internal work to do in the community that we're doing as well. As much as like, I mean, honestly, I think this is an amazing tool for teachers and people use it all the time, but it's really been a tool for us, for each other, to see each other more clearly. And yeah, there's still so much more work to do on that, but it's, to me, that's the most important part of the map.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing everything. This was a wonderful conversation and presentation. We're up at time for this part. We're going to take, I think, a few minutes before we come back at 1 o'clock West Coast time and 4 o'clock East Coast time for our sort of closing for this public symposium. So really encourage everybody to kind of just stick around or come back in a few minutes. And Dr. Blackwell, thank you again so much for being a part of this. We are really so grateful that that you joined us today.